Welcome to A Cup of Gratitude with Amanda Schaefer. Hi, I'm your host, and I'm so glad you stopped by. This podcast is really for anyone, anywhere, anytime. And it's about taking a moment to slow down and look around and actually see all of the good things that are there. There's no question that asks, is your cup half empty or half full? But I think a better question is, what's in your cup? I mean, a drop of gratitude will benefit your life unimaginably more than a full cup of anything else. So let's settle in and take a look at how we can shift our focus and embrace the joy and the wonder of the life that we have. And once you start, you won't be able to stop seeing the good. And just like me, you won't be able to stop talking about it. And somehow that creates even more. Even in the midst of difficulty, even when it's really hard. Learn how to drink from a cup of gratitude. Welcome. Today I am speaking with Kimberly Haar, who is a licensed therapist, author, and speaker with nearly 2 decades of experience in trauma recovery and marriage and family therapy, blending clinical insight with deep faith. She helps others move from pain to purpose. Drawing from her own story of healing, Kimberly shares a message of hope and restoration, reminding others that with God, no story is too shattered to be rewritten and no life too broken to be beautifully restored. A woman after my own heart. Welcome, Kimberly. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Amanda. I'm excited about being here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I remember our pre-recording phone call. It was really rich, and it showcased the beauty of being able to depend on God, even in those traumatic and tragic times, that He is good and He can take anything if we invite Him in, and He can work it for our good and for His glory, for those, of us who love Him. And your story is a great reminder of that. Now, for those of you who listen all the time, we do things a little differently over here. We start at the beginning in our childhood and work up to what we're doing now. And I do believe it's such a beautiful way to showcase that even though every single story is so unique and different, that God is consistent and always the same. And so for those of you who are new listeners, that's what we're going to do and what we always do. And it is just a way of seeing God in the everyday moments that really makes him so relatable and understandable. And for many has been actually something that's helped them come to believe that God is who he says he is. I've talked to a lot of people who listen because the stories of our lives are so compelling. And maybe they didn't go to church or they didn't read, the Bible, but they were listening to these stories and they would contact me and say, hey, I noticed, this person didn't know God and that person did. That person seemed pretty angry at God. That person actually ran away from God. And yet I noticed in every story, God is the same. And so he has used even the stories that I've shared on this podcast to help people understand who he is. And so I'm going to do this as long as he has for me. It's coming on 5 years, more than 250 episodes, and I just can't get enough of the encouragement, the hope, and the love contained in every single story. So with all of that in mind, would you, Kimberly, be willing to tell us a little bit about your childhood?
Yes, well, my childhood begins in the setting of Manitoba, Canada. I was a Canadian citizen and I was born into a home. I like to say from the very beginning, I was birthed into a home where 2 hearts were mending. Actually,
Mm.
3 hearts were mending if you include an older sibling.
Hmm.
I had an older sibling, but my mom and dad had a baby, and or my mom was pregnant with a baby, and that baby at birth lived just a few minutes and then died. And
Mm.
so it was almost 9 months to the month that I was born. I was, that baby that came next. So it was a time of they had been through deep grieving.
Hmm.
And I was born into a home where it was like doubly celebrated because there was new life. And
Mm.
I have 2 siblings. I have an older sister who's 4 years older and a younger brother who is 3 years younger. So I was that mischievous middle child. I gave my heart to Jesus when I was 5 years old.
Wow.
And that was one of those, even though I was so young, I was brought up in a home where I knew that Jesus, I was in need just of it like everybody of a savior, but so at a very young age, I asked Jesus in my heart.
That's a wonderful childhood, and wow, I sometimes am so excited to hear that people can accept Jesus at such a young age. And when I look back at my own story, unfortunately, I did not. Um, but I can see, I call them glimmers. These glimmers, now that I look back, I can see places where he showed me who he was. And had I only had just a little bit more of an atmosphere where people talked about him. I sometimes wish that I would have had more time with him, but I know he uses the years that the locusts have eaten for us to reach others. But what a beautiful childhood it sounds like you had, and how wonderful that you were so loved and so wished for, and that that from the get-go. Now, you had told me about this time though, when you're about 7 when your family moved and you said you left everything behind. Could you tell us a little bit about that time?
When I was 7 years old, my mom and dad made the decision to move to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and which was a very far ways away from this little town in Manitoba. It was about 1,000 miles.
Mm.
But my dad produced children's Bible story books and tapes. And so he wanted to come more to the Midwest where he felt like he could do this better. And so at the age of 7, we packed up everything. I left my friends, my family, my grandparents, and it was starting all over again. So there was some grieving of obviously, leaving, especially my grandparents behind. So we would stay in contact. I would record little audio tape messages to them, and we would mail audio tapes back and forth.
Oh, I love that.
And so that was kind of why we moved to Tulsa, though, was to pursue the calling God had placed on my dad's life.
Yeah. And this is not something I had thought about until you just said it, but when you talk about those tapes, it makes me think of some of the people that I have in my life who are very, very busy and our schedules never quite sync up. And so we leave each other voice notes, these big
Right.
long voice notes. And the cool thing about that, and then thinking about what you do for a living, that when you listen to a voice note, you're just listening. You're
Right.
not having a conversation. You're not joining in and sharing anything. You're just really leaning in and listening. And there's something so beautiful about just listening well.
Well, I kind of laughed because as a little girl, I assumed and I pretended like I was not just talking, but I was listening. So I
Hmm.
would tell my grandparents, I would say things on the audio tape like, "What song would you like me to sing?" And then I'd be quiet for a minute and I'd say, "Okay, I'll sing that song." Just that childlike innocence was
Hmm.
absolutely present from the very beginning.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And, it's wonderful you were able to keep in touch in that way, that you kind of felt still connected with them because you would hear their voice. And what a beautiful thing that they were able to do that with you. Now, during our pre-recording call, you had mentioned a time when your brother broke his leg. And you told me, and I just want to share this because this is very unusual, right? That you actually carried him from room to room. You didn't want him to feel any pain. I think that's such a big indicator of your heart. What do you remember about that?
Right. Well, during the summers, we moved to Tulsa for the winters, but because we were Canadian, we had to go back to Canada every summer for 6 months.
Hmm.
And my mom and dad owned a fishing lodge. And so, but it was a fly-in fishing camp. So we couldn't just drive to the hospital, drive to the doctor. And this particular time, I was probably maybe 9 years old, and my younger brother was about 6.
Mm.
And he had gotten into some mischief, climbing on top of things he shouldn't have. And he fell off and he broke his leg, but it was nighttime and we could not fly him out to the hospital. And so it hurt my heart so much that he was
Mm,
in pain that
hmm.
I would lift him up. And here I am, just a little girl myself, barely able to carry his body,
Yeah.
but I would carry him from room to room so he didn't have to feel pain.
Mm.
And my family would kind of tease me, and they called me Nurse Florence because it was, if he needed something, I was there. It was almost like ringing a bell, and I would do anything to keep him from feeling pain.
Mm. Wow. I love the way God writes stories. That little detail really stuck out to me when we were talking, and it's a big indicator of what your heart is like. And I think when we look back, we're able to see things about parts of our personality that got intentionally placed in us. We see as we go through the story a lot of things that God didn't intend for us to happen, but we live in a fallen world and how he will take all of it and work it together. But I love to see the intentional things of how he made you. Now, you told me that you really loved playing school, and I was wondering, did you end up doing anything with that? Why do you think that was?
Well, I did love playing school, and part of that is because I would go with my dad to his office,
Hmm.
and he was, self-employed, but in one of the rooms he had a big whiteboard. And I think as a little girl, I don't know if I was just bored and I needed something to do, but I would get out the markers and I would, spell big words, and I would begin to
Mm.
pretend I was a teacher and I had students there, and it was just one of those things. I've always been a people person. And
Hmm.
when you ask if I ever did anything with that, and I know I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but I would
Hmm.
eventually go to college for 2 years to become a school teacher. I just
That's
never,
awesome.
I never followed through with that.
Hmm.
Although in what I do now, I definitely there's part teacher.
Yeah, well, my daughter is a therapist. So is her husband. They're both getting their doctorates, and they also see patients as well, and they're adjunct professors. But she started out wanting to be a teacher, and then when she took psychology, just as a course in college, was completely smitten and switched her major, but she now uses it so much in her practice, and I think I can see that, being her mom and seeing how the two go together. I would think that that makes a lot of sense.
Well, I do in my therapy practice. If you walked into my office, you would
Mhm.
see one wall is almost entirely a big whiteboard. So I still brought that teacher whiteboard with me.
Yes.
I just took it in what I do now.
Yeah, that's amazing. Again, God has the best stories. Every little detail. He doesn't really waste anything. He really
That's
doesn't.
right.
Yeah. Now, when you were about 12 years old, you said that your parents met a pastor who invited your family to visit their church, and they asked you to come forward. The pastor had something he wanted to tell you. He said the Lord had for you. Do you remember what that was?
I do. And it was a pastor and his wife who had come to our fishing camp during the summer. And so we were on our way traveling back to Oklahoma.
Hmm.
And so we were stopping in at this church in Kansas on our way. And when we went there, again, I probably would have been about 10 years old, maybe
Hmm.
10, 11 years old. And I don't know if it was at the beginning of service or at the end, but the pastor asked me to come forward to the front of the church. I don't know if it was a time of prayer or, exactly what the circumstances were, but
Hmm.
he and his wife began praying over me, and he looked at me and he held my hands and he just made the comment. He said, "I really feel like the Lord is telling me that there's going to be healing in your hands."
Hmm.
And as a little child, what we hear is like it begins to take root, and
Yeah.
it births something. And it was
Hmm.
almost like there was something being planted in me that I knew somehow, somewhere in my life, something having to do with my hands would, bring about healing in lives.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And again, I do think something was planted in you. And I think that God uses all kinds of ways to speak things into us. And it's a matter of whether we believe it or not. But his word doesn't come back void without accomplishing what he sends it to do. And his word is seed. And so I think that when we're exposed to these seeds of truth, and then somebody kind of points out to us one particular thing that God has shown them, I think we recognize it, even at such a young age. And I do believe it starts to root down and begin to take hold. Our callings are really interesting things, and the way that God ends up using them in each individual is just so multifaceted. Your story is a good indicator of that when we get in
Yeah.
later, and it just to me it's always intriguing. As a storyteller, I love a good story, and I just sometimes see threads and themes that others don't see, and your particular story has lots of them. So, I had asked you the question about whether you had dated or not, and you told me that you were in love just about every 4 or 5 days. I'm wondering, was it because you saw so many new people at the camp? Like,
I
what do
think
you
it
think?
was. I
Yeah,
think it was.
yeah.
Every 4 or 5 days, we would have fathers and sons that would fly into our fishing camp for their
Hmm.
fishing adventures. And so these sons were typically at that time, they were, they're teens, late teens, and so here I'm in my early teens, and I think I just was so. I loved the idea of love, and so
Hmm.
I found myself, I would give my heart. I was sure I was in love every 4 days.
Well, yeah, during the pre-recording call, you told me you thought you were going to marry Donny Osmond. Sorry, that didn't work out, but
With
I
Well, now he didn't come to my fishing camp. He was,
no,
yeah, yeah, but I
yeah,
did when I was younger. I
yeah,
was certain I was going to marry Donny
yeah,
Osmond,
yeah. That's so
along with
funny.
half of the
Yes.
world that was going to marry Donny Osmond.
Well, I ask this question a lot, and honestly, it's funny because some people come back with an answer like yours, like, yeah, I was always either in love with somebody or, having a new crush or dating someone, and other people, it's crickets. They had no interest at all. And it's interesting to see, how we feel at a young age and whether or not we feel connected to people and whether or not we're interested in love. And so it's definitely a part of your story. Now, I asked you whether you had anything that really stuck out in your rest of your junior high and high school years. Is there anything that pops to mind?
I think the main thing is I went to a Christian high school, junior
Hmm.
high school. So again, I was very sheltered in my growing up. And even though I was definitely having crushes as a young girl,
Hmm.
I didn't have a lot of guy friends that were interested in me. I made some good girlfriends, but there was always that kind of looking for, okay, who's the person that is going to be my person,
Yeah,
and that wouldn't happen for a little bit.
yeah. Okay. Now, you ended up going off to college,
Hmm.
and you told us you started off being interested in teaching. You met your first husband at your church, and you told me you got married within about a year.
Hmm.
You had your first daughter after 2 years, your second daughter after that, and you said you wanted to try one more time for a boy. So
Oh,
I'm wondering, like, do you know why, and how did that go for you?
well, after I had my first two children, they were both girls. I told my first husband, I said, I can't explain it, but something inside me is just telling me we're not done. We're not supposed to be done.
Hmm.
And so I decided that I was going to tell God what he should do. So I was driving in my car to work one day and I'm praying out loud. And I
Hmm.
said, Lord, we're going to try for another baby. I said, we'd like a boy this time. A girl would be okay, but please don't give me twins. And 9 months later, I had boy girl twins. And
Wow.
so I laugh and say it must have been a busy day in heaven because all the Lord caught was boy, girl, and twins, not the or and the not. And so we rounded our family out with four children. It was busy. Man, those
Hmm.
first few years, I had four kids under the age of 5. And
Wow.
so it was busy, but it was a wonderful time.
Yeah. Now you had some medical things going on with your son in the beginning. What was that like?
When my twins were born, my son was born with a disease called Hirschsprung disease.
Hmm.
And it is a genetic disease that affects, I think it's like 1 in 10,000 babies. And it is known more to be a boy's disease. And so for 6 months, he had to have a colostomy.
Oh, wow.
And at 6 months old, it was reversed. So
Hmm.
while I was getting used to having four children under the age of five, one of them had special needs. And so I was having to not just change lots of diapers, I was having to learn the special skill of how do you change colostomy bags. And
Wow.
although it was later reversed when he was 6 months old.
Yeah. Well, thank God. And that sounds like a lot. That sounds very heavy.
It was very heavy. It
Yeah.
was very heavy, but somehow we got through it.
Yeah. A lot of things are like that, right? We look back and you're like, in the moment, you almost get to a point of being numb, with certain situations, and you look back and you're like, "Wow, I got through it.
Right.
Well, praise God that he ended up being healthy. And, I want to move into another subject that might seem like it makes no sense to just get right into, but it was really where we went next in our original conversation. After all of this time and getting through things like that, and being married, and being a mom, and being a wife, and all of the things, you found out that after 23 years of living with your husband that he was having an affair, and
Yeah.
you end up filing for divorce. Can you tell us a little bit about that time? Because you want to talk about heavy. That seems like a blind side.
Yeah. You know, right after I had had my twins, within a few years, all of my children were still very young, and I discovered, my ex-husband. There was kind of like ongoing. I'd find pornography, or I'd find, evidence of him speaking to somebody. But in
Hmm.
2013, I actually discovered where he had been in an affair.
Hmm.
And, up until that point, I had chosen to forgive my ex
Hmm.
husband. And I think that maybe I wish looking back, I did lots of forgiving. I didn't do a lot of setting healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
And, I had four young children. And so in my mind, it really was not an option for me to leave because I
Yeah.
didn't know how I would do it.
Hmm.
So in 2013, my youngest children, my twins, were 15 years old. And that's when I discovered that my ex-husband was actually in an affair.
Hmm.
And when I discovered that, I knew that I could no longer stay in my marriage. And I made the decision to go ahead and file for divorce.
Hmm.
And that was probably the hardest decision I have ever had to make in my life.
Yeah. And I I understand that that was obviously such a difficult situation, but as you said, you can't continue on in something that's not healthy. And having been divorced myself and dealt with all the dynamics of having children, and how am I going to do this on my own, and what's best, I do know that giving an example to your children of what's healthy is always what's best. We don't realize it in the moment because it just seems so hard to make that decision. But um, so you're able to do that. How did life move forward after that?
Well, after I got divorced, the day I got divorced, I say that a blanket of shame wrapped itself around me.
Mm,
And I walked out of that courthouse where the judge pronounced it legal, and I felt like I was wearing a letter D on me for
mm-hmm,
divorced, disqualified, defective,
mm-hmm,
damaged. I told myself God could never use me again. I
mm-hmm.
told myself I had failed my children. I had failed God. There was such a heavy shame on me that I had to spend a lot of time really beginning to work through those hurts, those wounds.
Right.
And so in what I did is I found myself working through those 4 years because I was now a single mom.
Mm-hmm,
And I determined in my heart that I was not going to remarry or date anybody until my youngest children were ready to go away to college. I didn't
mm-hmm.
want them to have to fight for my attention. And
Right.
so that's what I did for those 4 years. But in the beginning of 2017, that's when I woke up and I just felt a stirring in my heart that said, "This is the year you're going to be married again."
Mm-hmm.
And I could swear I heard the words, "Buckle your seatbelt." And I just thought that meant this is going to go fast.
No, those are Holy Spirit words.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
It's like little did I
yeah,
know what
yeah.
was yet to come.
hmm so you had gone back to school to be a marriage counselor and family therapist as well, when we kind of had skipped over that. So this is where you were, kind of spending your focus was actually to pour out and try to help others. And God tells you this, and you told me that you ended up joining not one, not two, not even three,
Not four.
not four, but five online dating sites. Why five? And like, how many first dates did you have before you decided like that this was
Okay.
for you?
Yeah, well, let me back up for a minute and say
Uh-huh.
I became a marriage therapist. I went back to school when my kids were little. So at the
Oh,
time
okay.
of my divorce, I was already a therapist.
Okay.
And so when I made the decision though to join five dating sites, how that came to be is I was raised at a fishing camp. And
Mm-hmm.
I know that if you want to catch a fish, and if you put
Mm-hmm.
one line in the water, you've got a good chance at catching a fish. But if
Right.
you put five lines in the water, you have a better chance at catching a fish. So I thought that this whole concept would play out the same way on dating sites. If I was going to do this, I was going to
Mm-hmm.
really do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell you, online dating is not for the weak at heart.
Yeah.
I had 13 first dates, and I was at the point where I was like, okay, this is not the way I'm going to find the person that
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to marry. This just isn't for me.
Yeah.
But I decided I had been reached out to by a man named Andrew. He was an engineer,
Mm-hmm.
and he wanted to meet for breakfast. And in my mind, I thought, okay, this will be my last date. This will be my last online date. He looks nice. He could
Mm-hmm.
use a friend, but I was not anticipating anything out of it. And so when I met him at the diner for breakfast, of all places, I almost immediately knew this was the man I was going to marry.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a knowing inside me. There was a kindness. We spent 3 or 4 hours, sitting there talking, and but just something inside me. It was like I knew my heart felt like it was home.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a beautiful thing to have happen after what you had been through.
Yes,
Yeah. Now, you told me you dated for 4 weeks, and then your ex-husband asked if you could meet up with him to talk to him, and ended up being about him wanting to date you again.
that's right.
What happened?
Well, we had had a friendly divorce. Even when I divorced, it wasn't because I didn't love him. I
Mm-hmm.
just knew that I couldn't be married to him.
Yeah.
And so he had asked me to come to his home. We were going to talk about our adult children, and we had done that many times before. And I had no reason to think this time would be different. So I
Mm-hmm.
went to his home and he began talking about wanting another opportunity to show me changes he had made.
Mm-hmm.
That he wanted us to give us another chance. And by
Mm-hmm.
this time, I'd already started dating Andrew, and I knew that's where my heart was. So I told him, I said, you know what? I've moved on, and I
Mm-hmm.
think you need to move on too. And when I said those words, he looked at me and he said, maybe I need to go have a talk with that man. And it
Mm-hmm.
didn't make any sense to me because I didn't know he knew anything about him. I would later learn that my ex husband had been stalking me. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I left my ex husband's home, I called Andrew on the phone and I said, hey, can I stop by your house just for a few minutes? Because I wanted to give him a heads up. My ex
Yeah.
husband may make a nuisance of himself, might try and spread a rumor.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I just didn't want Andrew to get scared away.
Right.
So I went by Andrew's house. I explained what had happened. And I asked him, I said, Andrew, would you fight for me? And he looked down at me and he said, well, of course I would. He goes, you're worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And so little did I know what those words were going to come to mean about fighting,
Yeah.
because I went home that evening and I was getting into bed and something stirred in me and said, lock your bedroom door. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I was living alone because I was empty nesting and I always locked my house, but I really didn't lock my bedroom door. But that night I got up and I locked my bedroom door.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to sleep, wasn't scared, and at 2:30 in the morning I woke up to my bedroom door crashing down off the hinges. My ex-husband had broken into my home, and
Mm.
for the next 4 hours I was assaulted.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Well,
Oh.
after the assault, he kidnapped me and he told me that as punishment for ruining his life,
Mm-hmm.
he was going to take me to Andrew's house and he was going to make me watch him as he killed Andrew.
Wow.
And so it went from, 4 hours of assault to now a kidnapping, and now we're driving to the house where I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And obviously, my heart was in fear.
Yeah. There's really no way to even try to put ourselves in your place. That is just so outlandish sounding, but I know that these types of things happen, this unrequited, you know, loves. You mix in, somebody who obviously is dealing with some issues, and then you add in alcohol and all of the other things that you as a therapist could probably tell us about his personality, that you've kind of told us without telling us, just by the things that he's done, and it's just so unbelievable that something like that could happen, especially after having a fairly friendly divorce. But when you tell me that you found out that he had been stalking you,
Sure.
um, it's just,
Well, and I like,
everything. Go
go
ahead.
ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna say everything in me was like clutching, as you were talking, even though I've already heard the story from you before, because I think we put ourselves there when we hear what's happening. Like we can imagine being in that kind of harm's way.
Well, and I like to say that in the 23 years we had been married, there actually was no domestic violence. So there
Hmm.
was no reason I would have expected this kind of behavior.
Hmm.
And so when my ex-husband took me and we got to Andrew's house, he looked over at me and he left the keys in the ignition as he reached in the back seat for, his gun and bullets. And he said, "Now you go do what you need to do."
Hmm.
And so I actually jumped into the driver's seat and I made a getaway. But as I was getting away to go get help, I heard three gunshots. And
Hmm.
so I knew that there was no way Andrew was going to survive this. And so what happened is I escaped and I went to a super center where I walked in and I screamed, "Call 911." But at this
Hmm.
time, I was unrecognizable because of the assault, and
Hmm.
911 was called, and police and ambulances were dispatched to both of us. So I wouldn't hear from Andrew again. I was taken to a hospital emergency room where I spent the day, making sure that, I was okay. And while I was in the emergency room, his adult son had called my cell phone, and I had only met him one time.
Hmm.
But he left a message for me that said, "We're so sorry this happened, but we
Hmm.
think the two of you guys need to go your separate ways."
Mm.
And so
Wow.
my heart was grieving even more than what had happened to me. I was grieving the idea of here I thought I had found the person I was going to make the rest of my life with,
Hmm.
and now he was gone. And
Mm.
I would later find out he had been shot 10 times. He did survive, but he had been shot 10 times.
Wow, 10 times. That's amazing that he survived. And I am so sorry because, yeah, the last thing you want to hear is that you're not even going to get a chance to see him after all of that. So I can understand his son's first response, but like, how did you get to one another again? What
Yeah.
happened?
Well, I left the emergency room and my aunt and uncle were leaving for Canada for the summer. And so they had a home in the south part of town. And they told me, they said, "We want to gift you our home for the next 6 months, for the summer, so that I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have to go back to what had been my home, but now was just a house to me."
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to my uncle and aunt's house, and this is where I wouldn't hear from Andrew for almost 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, that's when I'll say my faith really was that's where it got real, where I had to begin the process of healing everything that
Mm-hmm.
had gone on. And when you ask how we got back together again, it was like 5 or 6 weeks later, and I got a message from Andrew on it came through Facebook Messenger. I've never been
Hmm.
so happy for Facebook Messenger before because his
Right.
kids had taken my phone number out of his phone.
Hmm.
And so the message just said, "Hey, I'm alive."
Mm.
And, how do you respond to that?
Yeah.
So I was like, yippee, and I tried explaining that I had not had any part in this. I hadn't
Hmm.
led my ex-husband to his home. And I said, "Can I come and see you?"
Hmm.
And he said, "No, not at this time," because he was going in for another surgery because his wounds were infected.
Hmm.
And so he asked me, he says, "I'll contact you in 4 or 5 days." And he did. And when he did, he gave me permission to come up to the hospital to actually see him.
What was that time like for you?
Oh my goodness. When I opened his hospital room door, and first of all, he told me I needed to come when his adult children weren't there. So here I
Hmm.
am, 50 years old, and I'm sneaking around adult children.
Right.
And I walked in, and I still had some bruising on my face. And I looked at him and I said, "Andrew, where does this leave us?" Because we had talked about getting married.
Yeah.
Andrew had told me he knew he wanted to marry me. And so when I said, "Where does this leave us?" he looked up at me and he said, "I don't know." He said,
Hmm.
"I've read the felony counts." He goes, "I know what happened to you." And he
Yeah.
said, "You're going to really be messed up." And he says, "I know what happened to me and I'm going to be messed up."
Hmm.
And something came over me and I shook my finger in his face and I said, "Andrew Har, you will never meet another woman like me." And that evening, I was in his room, until they kicked me out.
Hmm.
And 4 weeks later, we were engaged. And 4 months later, we were married. And that was actually 8 years ago. So we've been married 8 years.
Wow. Praise God. That's amazing. Whew, I mean, there's so many reasons why it could have ended just there, but I am so grateful that you both leaned in to what God had for you, which was each other. One of the things that we talked about in our pre-recording call quite a bit was you ended up writing a book about what happened to you. And one of the things that you really wanted to grab a hold of was that you weren't going to be a victim, that that wasn't your identity. And being a therapist, working with people and eh, deciding to share about this was probably a really hard decision. But you said you knew if you pulled back the curtain to say me too, that others would be able to relate. So tell us a little bit about that process of starting to write your book. What's the name of your book? We'll have everything in the show notes for people to take a look. And I think we're even going to do a giveaway of your book. But let's see how you got from the actual time that everything happened to into writing.
Yeah. As in those 6 weeks between everything that happened and when I talked to Andrew again, I like to say that's really where my healing journey began. And up until this happened, I've been a therapist almost 20 years. So at
Mm-hmm.
the time of this, I'd been a therapist 13 years and I had walked many people through deep, hard, painful stories. This
Mm-hmm.
time it was mine.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go, after everything had happened, I would have to go down to the Victim Witness Center
Mm-hmm.
at our courthouse because I was making statements and when I would go in there, there was a piece of paper that they wanted me to sign each time to sign in on, but it said victim sign here. And there was a
Mm.
little arrow of where I was supposed to sign. And I remember it would make me angry and frustrated when I would see that because I thought, on that day, I was a victim,
Mm-hmm.
but I will not let that victim it's not going to define me.
Yeah.
And it's like I was victimized, absolutely. On that
Mm-hmm.
day, I was a victim, but that's not the end of my story. And so when I began thinking about writing a book, what really was that deciding factor was that the day everything happened, I had no control over what people knew about my story. It was all over the news, the media, all about a
Right.
woman being hurt. And I thought, so my story was here's a woman that's been assaulted and kidnapped and hurt. And that
Mm-hmm.
was the end. And I
Yeah.
thought I didn't want to let the enemy have the last word of my story because I
Mm-hmm.
wanted people to know the real story was here was a woman that was hurt deeply, but the real story was she ran to Jesus and found healing.
Right.
And as a therapist, we're the ones that hold stories. We're not talking about ourselves, but I saw that there was a need for me to pull back that curtain. It's not
Hmm.
dropping a mask because it's not a mask, but it was pulling back the curtain that
Hmm.
said, you know what? Life happens to all of us.
That's right.
Me too.
Yeah.
And there is no pain Olympics. There
Yeah.
is no, pain is pain is pain is pain.
Hmm.
And what I wanted to really reach out to the reader of my book was that here's some steps in healing because life is hard, life hurts, but does heal.
Hmm.
And so I wrote about my story, but I would include prayers and reflections, and I made it more into well, how is this going to relate to anybody and everybody that's gone through hurt, loss, and trauma?
Hmm.
And so that's what I did. The first part of the book, I told my story, but then the second part, I included what I call tools for growth and healing. And it
Hmm.
was like, hey, these are tools that not only have I used with my clients through the years, but these are tools that I used myself. And
Yeah.
so it was like, here, you're not just reading my story, you're also saying, hey, here's some tools. Here's an example. And so that's why I wrote the book Healing from Life's Deepest Hurts, and I subtitled it Reclaiming Your Life After Grief, Loss, or Trauma.
Yeah, a very, very great resource and something that all of us deal with, like you said, to varying degrees. And I love the fact that you gave people kind of a tool belt. You gave them something, that they could use to work through the things that they're going through. And it doesn't really surprise me that somebody who is a therapist would do that. That you would turn it into something um, that would be purposeful. And that really is God's specialty, right? He'll take the things, he'll walk with us through it, help us to heal when we come to him. But then he does want us to overflow that in some way. Now, it's not always something archival like a book, but in your case, there are more people that you can reach with something like that. So, how did you actually go about publishing? Did you know anything about that? Did you ever want to write?
I did. I knew I had something in me, probably, I'll say 15, 18 years ago, that something in me, I knew I was going to write a book.
Hmm.
Now, I thought it was going to be about trusting, but I thought it was going to be more along the lines of trusting, rebuilding trust in a marriage after infidelity or trusting, how do you trust yourself? And I went to Barnes and Noble bookstore and
Hmm.
I even bought two books by a woman that had the same last name as me, because Har is my maiden name. So I looked at this woman that had the same name as me and I bought her two books and I put them on my bookshelf so that I could keep in front of me and see what someday my name would look like on my book. And so there was like this knowing inside me, there's a book in me.
Yeah.
But it would not come for, 15, 17 years later. But
Hmm.
I always knew there was going to be a book.
Yeah, I love that. And, I said just the other day to somebody that writers write and writers read, but they also have focus and can visualize. And I love that you just gave that example because every time I write something, I do my cover first, and people are like, "What is wrong with you?" Like I literally need to know what it's going to look like so I continue till I get it done,
Yeah.
you know. And so I love that. I love that you kind of challenged yourself and gave yourself kind of this end goal so that you could keep going. And sometimes publishing isn't the easiest thing to do. So how did you actually get it to the point where it's out into the world? Did
Yes.
you, yeah,
Even that is a God story
yeah.
because I knew nothing about publishing. I had been a part of different publishing groups, and
Hmm.
I knew you need things like a book proposal and you need to do this and that. And what happened is I was a part of a writers group, and you could sign up. If you signed up early enough, you could
Hmm.
sign up for a meeting with an editor or, a literary agent. And
Hmm.
so I was planning, okay, I knew the exact day that they were going to open up that opportunity. You had to sign up for it, but there's not very many spots. So you had to be right there, right then. So I knew exactly which publisher I was going to reach out to. And
Hmm.
but the day that that was supposed to open and happen,
Hmm.
I got a phone call right before the time of when you would have to sign up, and it was with some pretty hard news in my family. And I missed that opportunity to be one of the first people to sign up. And
Hmm.
so the following day, I went back to, the sign up sheet, and the publisher I wanted was no longer an option. But I saw that there was an acquisitions editor
Hmm.
for Baker Books, which is who published my book. And I remember at the time I thought, well, it's probably not going to go anywhere, but it'll be good practice. So I
Hmm.
signed up for this meeting, but the day of the meeting, I missed my meeting because I didn't configure that Eastern time, Central
Oh
time. So
no.
I was there an hour. I think I was an hour late. And
Hmm.
so she came on and she's like, I'm so sorry you missed your meeting. And I just said, I totally understand. I tried to be gracious. And in my heart, I just thought, okay, it wasn't
Hmm.
meant to be.
Hmm.
But she looked at me and she said, you know what? How about if next week I'm going to send you a link and I'm going to do it right from the publishers, from my work office, and you and I'll have a one-on-one. And so the following week, rather than getting a 15-minute interview, she and I
Hmm.
had about an hour and 20 minutes interview.
Wow,
And
that's
at the
amazing.
end of it, she asked me, she said, is there any other questions you have? And I said, yes. Would Baker Publishing House be interested in my book?
Hmm.
And she said, well, do this, 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 and this, and have it back to me in 2 days.
Hmm.
And she was going to present it to their board, and she explained the whole publishing process. And so I got it back to her. Long story short, they did make me an offer. They did accept my book. And it was probably 60 days after I was accepted. My acquisitions editor, I think her husband maybe took a job somewhere else, and she left my publishing house. And, I think I could not have made this happen if I tried because I,
Yeah.
I missed the meeting. I missed the publisher
Yeah.
I was planning on. Everything didn't work out, yet
Yeah.
God opened a door when it was supposed to open.
Yeah. God's timing is impeccable. And honestly, when we step in and obey, when we feel we're supposed to do something, when we obey Him and it's part of what He has for us to do, He will make it happen in such a way that we get to tell the story and He gets the glory. And I love that so much. That's such a great part of your story. Now, I could probably go get a cup of coffee and we could talk for a couple of more hours. But in light of time, I always end the podcast with this question. And I know we can't go back, but I know that someone listening might be able to apply the wisdom of your answer to their life today. So if you could go back and give your younger self any advice, what would that be?
Well, I've got two answers on this. One is if I could go back to my little girl self, my 7, 8, 9 year old,
Hmm.
I would really let myself know, you know what? That mischievous, goofy, fun side that, you kind of learn to dampen down. It's like you're so perfectly and wonderfully made and be yourself. It's like I
Mm.
would give myself permission to embrace those things that through life we damper down and we kind of
Yeah.
don't let those parts of ourselves out.
Hmm.
If I could go back to the woman at age 51 when I was laying on my face underneath that pergola in the backyard of my aunt's house,
Hmm.
and if I would lay down beside her wrapped in that big green blanket, and I would just let her know she's stronger than she thinks. And
Hmm.
I would let her know that, you know what, where this feels like the end of the story, the end of the road, I'd say just hold on
Hmm.
because just wait till you see how God redeems this.
Hmm.
And so I think that I would just one love on her and just
Yeah.
be there and cheerlead her on.
Yeah. That's awesome. Very good answers, both of them, and very, very wise. And honestly, I think that one of the things I've learned to do is I talk to different ages of myself all the time. You know, redeemed, more grown up Amanda has a lot to offer, you know, to parts of my life where I didn't know Christ and I hadn't yet grown or healed. And so I think that's a beautiful answer. Um, and again, I could talk for hours. I've really enjoyed our conversation. We will be doing a giveaway of your book the week that your episode airs, whatever that is. And I would highly suggest that people go to the show notes and follow Kimberly and check out what she's doing. I know that once we do step in and do something God's asked us to do, He will often give us something new to do. So I'm sure you'll enjoy following her because I think there's more to come. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your story.
Thank you for having me, Amanda. I appreciate just the beautiful, beautiful job that you allowed this opportunity.
Oh, well, thank you. It has been my privilege. And I always say I'm the luckiest girl in the world. And yes, at 61, I'm still a girl because God has given me this beautiful thing to get to do, to be encouraged story after story after story. And it's an abundant life. It really is. And He is a good God. He really is. And I get to say that all the time. So I hope you have an amazing day.
Hey, so I just want to thank you so much for spending your time with me. And I want to challenge you to go out today and to just take notice and to stop and really look around and find at least good thing, one thing to be thankful for. You know, if you do that today, you're going to find so many more things tomorrow without even trying. Because once you start, you begin to see what's always been there. And if you need a refill, you can come join me again for another cup. Make sure to subscribe and have an awesome day and go be grateful.